So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, delete as appropriate, depending on where you are in the world. However, wherever you are, thank you for joining us for the launch of the Innovation Accelerator 2021 Apparel Barometer. I'm Peter Stanbury, one of the report's authors, and I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel. I'll ask them to introduce themselves a bit more fully in a minute, but just to sort of do a quick tour of who everyone is. From the US Cotton Trust Protocol, we have Tara Luckman. From WRAP Compliance, Avedis Seferian. Textile Exchange, Larry Pepper, and from April, Craig Tribolet. So why are we here? Why the barometer? The textile and apparel sector has long been under intense scrutiny over its environmental and social impacts. For example, a March 2020 report by the BBC claimed that fashion accounts for about 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And the World Economic Forum claims the sector to be the world's second biggest consumer of water. On the human side, there remain considerable challenges in setting up institutions in Bangladesh, which do not weaken the protections afforded to workers after the Rana Plaza disaster. And of course, there's the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which is posing such a challenge to the cotton sector. However, the industry is taking significant strides to respond. A huge range of initiatives and approaches are being taken by companies in the sector to reduce their environmental and social footprint and move towards genuinely sustainable apparel. Many of these have been set out and debated at Innovation Forum's annual Sustainable Apparel and Textiles conferences over the last 5 years. Yet much remains opaque. Of all the attention the sector has received and all the work that has been done, many questions remain, of which some of the more important appear to be, are the allegations made about the sector's impacts entirely correct? Of the approaches that companies are taking, which are the most effective in driving real change? What does a credible business strategy and a set of targets look like today? And what policy framework needs to be in place to support companies in delivering that? So we thought there's a need for a cool, detached assessment of these and other issues. And to address this, we at Innovation Forum developed the Sustainable Apparel Barometer, which we hope will provide a rigorous analysis of the environmental and social impact of the sector from raw material production through to retail and home delivery, and what approaches are the most effective in addressing these impacts. The aim of the report has been to cut through the noise and give some clear bases as to what a state-of-the-art sustainability strategy looks like in 2021. So what did we focus on? Obviously, the apparel sector is rather large. So to look at the whole thing was simply not going to be feasible. So what we've done is to focus on 3 deep dives into cotton, viscose, and issues around standards and compliance. And then from those deep dives to try to draw together some overarching lessons which emerge from these case studies, which we hope provide some guides to what a serious sustainability strategy in the sector looks like. So before I go to the speakers, just a quick few points on housekeeping. From here, I'm going to ask the supporters to introduce themselves, the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to look at some of the key findings of the report and illustrate each of these with examples from our speakers. And then depending on how time allows, we only have 55 minutes left, we'll try and come to questions from the audience. So you'll see that there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. So if you do want to make a point, please put your question in the chat box. But bearing in mind, I have to multitask and I'm a bloke. Therefore, keep your comments brief. Things that look like paraphrases of War and Peace, I probably won't come to. But if you manage to put your question in a pithy way, I'm more likely to be able to come to it. So without further ado, I'm going to let our panelists say a little bit about themselves. And in my usual practice is to just go in the way people are around the screen. And as that works, that means I'm starting, Tara, with you. So over to you, Tara.
Thank you, Peter. What a pleasure to join you today. I'll introduce myself as a fashion and textile sustainability consultant and an advisor to the US Cotton Trust Protocol. I have a background in brand sustainability, so I worked for about 20 years in apparel brands, driving the sustainability agenda from raw materials to manufacture and through to customer communication. It has been such an interesting evolution from 20 years ago when it was a tiny focus of the most forward-thinking brands to really now we can see it at the top of the agenda for the whole sector and the momentum that we see today. So coming on to the Cotton Trust Protocol and what it is, it's a new program. It was launched about a year ago, and it's intending to set a new standard in more sustainably grown cotton. So it's a farm level, science-based program that's bringing quantifiable and verifiable goals and measurement to the sustainable cotton production in the US in order to drive us in continuous improvement. It's based on the growing practices that have been more sustainable in the US cotton industry for decades, continuously improving, and we have further to go. We already have 300 members in the program. We're aligned to various industry goals, tight alignment with what the industry's got to achieve, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, good recognition from the Textile Exchange and Forum for the Future as a program that brands can use to hit their targets on more sustainable fibre adoption. We're also members of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, collaborating there. We're scaling at pace. 10% now of US cotton is already in the Protocol Consumption Management System, so our 2020 crop, and we're aiming to double that in 2021, and by 2025 we should have 50% of the US crop in our program. Two big contributions to the sustainable cotton agenda coming from this program. The first is transparency, so we're opening up access to robust data from the field, which is going to enable brands to accurately measure and track the environmental impacts of the cotton in their supply chain with validity and confidence to be able to communicate and report about it. And we're enabling that with a tracking technology. So we're tracking cotton's movement through the value chain, providing assurance of its origin. I'll leave it there for a quick introduction, but I'm looking forward to digging deeper as we discuss.
Thanks very much, Tara. And continuing around my screen, Avedis, over to you next.
Thank you, Peter. And like Peter said, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are. We've got over 150 people on this webinar, so I'm really thrilled to be a part of it. I'm Avedis Seferian, President and CEO of WRAP, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. For those of you not familiar with WRAP, we're a social compliance certification program. In fact, we are the largest independent factory-based certification program for the sewn products sector. Been around since the year 2000, and as Tara pointed out, we've seen a lot of change in these past couple of decades, especially in the level of attention social compliance has been getting, and the recognition of the importance of responsible sourcing practices with regards to the larger business sustainability question, not just reputational, but also physical and economic and financial. And of course, the pandemic has had a profound effect on sort of that and on further elevating the importance of this issue. So I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar, and also very thrilled to be supporting the barometer as a resource, as Peter put it, that's meant to quiet the noise. We do obviously need to have some noise in that we're communicating with each other, but we want it to be helpful, thoughtful, and ultimately practical. And that's what I am so excited to be contributing to, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have around these issues.
That's great, thank you. And so to go from the Americas to Asia, over to you next, Craig.
Thanks, Peter, and great pleasure to join you from Rhea, Sumatra, Indonesia this evening. I'm a forester and ecologist. I work for April, and April's a leading producer of fibre, pulp and paper, with forestry plantations and manufacturing operations here in Rhea province. We're the predominant supplier of wood-based fibre to our sister companies APR and Sattery, hence my presence this evening, and they're world-leading manufacturers of viscose, of course. We manage about 450,000 hectares of forest plantation and about 360,000 hectares of conservation as part of a production protection approach. It's a commitment to the sustainable production of renewable plantation wood fibre while supporting effective conservation and restoration work. We continue to work hard to accelerate our protection and restoration work, which is a key interest for me as an ecologist, while at the same time advancing our circularity in our manufacturing processes. And our strategy of 1 hectare of natural forest for every hectare of production plantation, which is sort of encapsulated in that nature needs half concept, is one example of the scale of the challenge we've set ourselves here. I see the barometer as a really positive step forward, Peter, and in this whole conversation around fibre, and very much looking forward to our conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. And last but certainly by no means least, over to Larray.
Hi, I'm Rhea Pepper. I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Textile Exchange. I'm also a cotton farmer. I grew up on a cotton farm and still involved in our family. So fibers of the land are certainly near and dear to my heart. So that's part of my DNA. We work as a textile exchange across a portfolio of materials. We're looking for best in class and a direction of travel predominantly on environmental issues, but certainly everything ripples out for there. So we want to move away from the status quo that may be chemically intensive or are not using best practices into, systems and initiatives. There's more and more of those. We're excited about seeing people taking those first steps into the initiatives that are doing less harm, that are using more sustainable practices, into actually things that are regenerative, organic, biodynamic. So we want people move along that continuum of where we are actually using fibers that are contributing positively to the farm, the family, the community, to our world. So it truly is about people and planet.
Okay, Larray, thanks very much indeed. So what we're going to do now is to move on to some of the findings which came out of the research for the barometer. And we think that there's probably 5 overarching themes which emerge from the work. But I'd just like to say before we go into that, thank you very much indeed to the speakers for sort of their participation today, but also for sort of backing us in doing this work. We wouldn't have been able to do it without your help. So the first sort of theme that emerged from all 3 of the chapters was sort of don't keep it simple. There seems to be not just in the apparel sector, but in quite a lot of the sustainability world, a desire to sort of almost to see one magic bullet as being the answer. And that isn't necessarily very helpful. And we need to get away from focusing only on one thing. So take certification as a good example of this. There's a very considerable focus within standards and certification on trying to reduce the number of standards that are out there. I've been around this business for sort of 25 years, and you go back to sort of Euro 96, there were no standards at all, but there's been an explosion of them since then. And I think there's a realization now that actually overburdens particularly supplier companies, supplier factories, and that therefore we must cut them down. But is that necessarily the right way forward? Because there's actually so much more to the question than just reduction in the number of standards. I mean, issues like second party versus third party audit. How do you come up with standards which simultaneously are globally relevant, but also can be applied in quite different local sets of local norms? So how can change be achieved in sort of complex situations? Now, RAP has done a lot of work in this space on what they call symphonization, which I think has been a very helpful way of trying to take a slightly more nuanced view to how standards and certification might be developed. And I'd like to come to you, Avedis, on that point. So perhaps you can say a little bit more about that.
Sure, be happy to, Peter. Yes, like you said, the history that we have witnessed these past couple of decades has been one of a proliferation of standards, and it has not proven helpful, nor has the attempts, multiple of them, to cut them down to one. The attempts that go by the moniker harmonization. And they've all failed, for the reasons you articulated. There is complexity out there, and this industry, more than any, understands the importance of sizing. You can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution. It doesn't get you what you need. It doesn't meet different people's needs at where they are in their supply chain journeys. So over that course, harmonization as a term itself got to be loaded with sort of negative meaning because of all the failed attempts. So we wanted to come up with a solution that does speak to reducing audit fatigue, because that is real, but is not burdened with the negative baggage of the term harmonization. And so we came up with this new term, symphonization, which really takes on the imagery of an orchestra. And the idea there is you're not going to have beautiful music made by just one single instrument playing a single note. You do need a variety of instruments to collectively make beautiful music. But at the same time, while you definitely don't want to keep it simple and insist on a single answer, you have to recognize that you have already several good options out there that together can form that orchestra. You don't have to then reinvent the wheel every time for yourself, or push a proprietary program, or create an additional standard. So there is a already established set of professional, independent, global organizations out there that do this. And all of them are slightly different from each other, but all of them do address the issues and various facets of it. You've got organizations like RAP that focus on the social side. You've got other certification programs that'll focus on the environmental side. We at RAP don't claim to be a one-stop solution. We don't think we're the experts on the environment. So you shouldn't expect one program to be able to meet all your sustainability needs. Identify that set of partners, and you're only going to need a handful. You don't need to, as I said, reinvent the wheel every time. And together you will have that either a chamber orchestra, if you want, you're starting off and you want to start small, or a full-size symphony orchestra if you are that far along advanced in your program and want to deep dive into various issues beyond simply the first tier or beyond simply that initial verification audit. So that's the heart of symphonization, the idea that you have professional partners out there. You're not going to be able to do it with just one, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel or create your own solution every time. All that does is exacerbate the audit fatigue problem. That's the solution out there. So don't keep it simple, but you don't have to overcomplicate it by trying to do everything on your own either. That's the message of symphonization.
Okay, Avedis, thank you very much indeed. So if the first conclusion is the need to sort of take a more holistic view of what's going on and a more nuanced view of what's going on, I think the second finding was very much being realistic and realism around the challenges that sustainability throws up. And I'm going to bring Rhea in at this point because she and I have had a sort of ongoing discussion over the last sort of month or so, because I find that in cotton, companies have gone from promising 100% sustainable cotton by 2025 to promising 100% more sustainable cotton by 2025. And that arguably, in my view anyway, that sounds potentially slightly dishonest. One is trying to elide sustainable and more sustainable. And, to what extent does that confuse consumers? But I'm going to come to Rhea at this point because she would say, well, sustainability is a journey. So Rhea, over to you.
Well, yeah, it is, where do you account for continuous improvement and moving along best practices? And so we've found, yes, the word sustainable has been around for a long time. We've got the word regenerative starting to pop up and being used a lot. And so it is about what gives clear definition and clear meaning. And so when people started saying this is sustainable, like, what does that mean? Does it because it's being used across a multitude of practices, a multitude of products that, we're a sustainable city. I'm a sustainable farm. Like, what is the true meaning of that? And so there's been some interesting things happening on the legal front and with things like the Federal Trade Commission and making legal claims about trying, brands have gone out there and said, I'm a sustainable product. But like, what backs that up? Where's their legal meaning? And so we have actually shifted because we're working on a direction of travel away from that status quo. We actually, for a lot of primarily legal reasons, and actually to be authentic and honest, like you talk about the nuances of it is a journey. We've got improvement to make. There's always improved practices for soils. There's improved practices for ecosystems. There's improved pack practices. And so at what point in time do you become sustainable? And do we want to use the word sustainable? Because don't we want to be restorative? Don't we want to be regenerative? Don't we want to address those holistic solutions? And so the bottom line is we've gone to using the word more sustainable because the word sustainable doesn't have a legal definition. So you can't say, like, when you say this is organic, there's legal laws that say to qualify for the use of the word organic, here's what that means. And the bottom line is there's not a legal definition for sustainable. So we feel like we're being more honest and more reflective of the change that we're creating, that there's a number in the world of cotton, there's a number of initiatives, 11 to 12, 13 of them, more coming, that are moving along this continuum, this direction of travel to more sustainable practices. And so we feel like that accurately reflects the journey that we're on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lorraine. And I think it is important that the difficulty of the challenge is recognized. But again, to come back to Avedis's point, that to not get scared by that. Yes, there's complexity out there, but it is a question of taking a step at a time. But if there is perhaps a lack of reality sometimes of players in the sector, I think it's also true that sometimes the critics of the sector are slightly less realistic than might be desired. If we take, for example, the issue of reforestation, which is something which is being pressed very strongly by a number of NGOs, if you actually start to work the numbers, companies like April will more or less have to reforest the whole of Indonesia to be able to satisfy the claims that are being made of them. The report talks to some degree about what April is doing in Indonesia to look at reforesting. So perhaps come to you, Craig, to talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Look, from the ecologist hat, I'd love to try and reforest all of Indonesia. I think it'd be a fantastic challenge, but the reality is a lot more difficult. There's 285 million people living in Indonesia. It's a growing democracy, and they're real challenges. And to be honest, it really is complicated and it is difficult. So I want to be realistic, but not pessimistic about the sort of challenges that we face. And I think, as the barometer notes, actually, in some of the final recommendations, and you mentioned it before, there is no magic bullet. Reforestation is certainly one strategy, but it's certainly not the only strategy out there. Sustainability cannot be achieved by simply focusing on a single idea. I think you need to recognise operational context, and clearly there's unlikely to be single, simple solutions. That's frustrating for people, of course. And I think you and Lorraine touched on some really important points. And part of that is about being honest, which is another recommendation from your report. Changing direction, implementing effective long-term sustainability solutions takes time, and it needs to be done properly. And monitoring, reporting, verification, they're all critical parts of that process. It's a long process, and part of it is also fundamentally understanding what the actual problem is. And that involves doing a root cause analysis and moving beyond what we've seen a lot of, which is actually addressing the symptoms and rarely addressing the problem. And I think the barometer might describe that as doing the heavy analytical heavy lifting. I think I've got that right, Peter. And these challenges can only be addressed effectively.
You've actually read it, which is very impressive.
If they're properly understood. There are plenty of examples, Peter, of perfectly excellent solutions addressing the completely wrong problem. And finally, I just want to reference the point that it's absolutely critical to really work with others. Certainly investing in in-house capability is important, but no one has all the answers, and no one can account for all the perspectives particularly of those people who are affected on the ground. And so I think it's important that recognising it's complicated and difficult. You're bound to make mistakes, but I think remaining optimistic is really critical, and not being afraid to take those first steps. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much indeed, Craig. So moving on, if there's a need to be realistic about the challenge, the third conclusion from this report is that therefore there's a need to be able to plot the journey to sustainability. Historically, what's tended to be the case is that when told that they're not sustainable enough, many in the apparel sector threw their arms up and said, well, it's very complicated. Supply chains are frightfully, multifaceted, very opaque. We can't possibly do anything. That's no longer an excuse. You can trace these supply chains, and U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol has demonstrated you can trace cotton right from the field, right to the garment. It's created into. So complexity is now no longer an excuse. So perhaps Tara, you can say something about how you've gone about that process of demonstrating that chain of custody all the way through.
Thank you. Yeah, just to reflect what we've already acknowledged, it's not one size fits all, and it is complex, it is challenging. So there is heavy lifting to be done. We're absolutely committed to really being able to provide the heavy lifting at farm level for cotton in the US in order that people can make good decisions elsewhere in the supply chain, so that brands can make those important sourcing decisions based on solid information, because there's so much at stake. So we're investing in getting the robust assured measurements cotton up through the value chain, through tracking the movement of that cotton to support those sourcing decisions. So we're collecting primary data from all of our participating farms, applying rigorous assurance around that data collection, and then working with advanced agricultural data modelling tools to understand the specific impacts relevant to the local context, and what's the pathway to improvement so that we can collaborate with our farmers to really improve in line with climate science. So for the first time, brands and retailers are going to be able to access year-on-year field level data demonstrating the progress that US Cotton is making on very specific measures, not more sustainable as a broad brush, but actually specific impacts on land use, soil loss, water, energy, greenhouse gases, and soil carbon. So we're getting to really specific, locally relevant data analysis, empowering farmers on their journey to improvement, but also empowering the brands through tracking that information with the cotton as it moves and tracks its way through their supply chain with a technology, a blockchain tracking solution, to be able to make robust claims, to be able to talk more confidently to their consumers about the impacts of the cotton in their products.
Thank you very much indeed. But I think what's also interesting is it's that traceability is incredibly important, but there are a lot of other factors which are necessary for sustainability. And I know Textile Exchange, Rhea, you've been working on something called the Delta framework to try and map all of these different issues and sort of to be able to plot a sort of direction of travel, for want of a better expression. So perhaps you could say a bit about that, because I certainly found that very interesting reading.
Yeah, actually, the Delta framework is from a consortium of us. I know like ICIL's been funding it, as well as Better Cotton Initiative. It's working across other crops like coffee. We've got Cotton Connect working on it. So there's a number of people piloting the Delta framework. And so if we're going to make this investment in change, it is how we measure it. And there could be dozens of ways to do it, but that synthesize it into what's the methodology that we're going to use on key performance indicators, not dozens of them, but a dozen of them. So the Delta framework has synthesized it, brought it down. We're actually going to be piloting this across not just cotton, which is where we're piloting this year, but into our other land-based fiber materials, whether that's wool or cashmere or alpaca. And even as we go into pilots with man-made cellulosics, of how do we really capture what we call ROI squared. You're making an investment. We're asking the brands to make an investment in more sustainable and responsible organic fiber. So what does it look like for them to have a return on their investment? If I'm paying more, show me that I'm having an impact on carbon. Show me that I'm having an impact on animal welfare. Show me. And so I think something like the Delta framework is something, again, we're trying to get one common tool to have a way to communicate progress against goals and those key things, whether that's carbon, water stewardship, biodiversity. So it is about the key messages and being able to convey value, that we're really breaking away from a price paradigm into a value paradigm, because we're asking for more investments to be made at the land-based level. I can't grow organic cotton on a maybe. It has to be with clear market messages so that I can make those investments into creating a dynamic and implementing best practices on my farm.
Thanks, Rhea. Avedis, I think you want to come in on this as well.
Yes, and of all the conclusions that the paper arrives at, I mean, they're all valuable and important. I think this one is worth thinking about in the sort of larger philosophical sense, because it is a journey. Sustainability, too many of the critics in particular tend to think of it as a destination. And that's not what this is. We're never going to get to a point where we're going to be able to declare victory and say we are now sustainable. It is an ongoing, constant journey with multiple facets. Craig made this point. Actually, every one of us have made this point, that there are all kinds of different elements to it. One of my continuing frustrations with the conversation around sustainability is that it does tend to focus largely on the environment, and that is well deserved. It is a very important part of the discussion. But what I liked about the barometer and this discussion is we recognize that there's a more holistic approach that's required, and that includes the workers, that includes the social compliance side, for example. So the complexities that we've all alluded to are real. There's been some back and forth on the chat about, needing bold strokes and not being able to do it with intermediate steps, and all that is true. You can't cross a canyon in 2 small leaps, but there are multiple canyons to be crossed here. So the idea is you have to understand that you can't do it all alone, A, and B, you can't do it all at once. So plotting the journey, I like the way you put it, Peter, is the important element here, to pick the battles you can win, pick the battles you're able to find good partners for, and recognize that it is an ongoing journey. It's not simply, I'm going to cross this canyon and I'm there. So I wanted to make sure we emphasize that point.
Thanks. And that, in true talk radio style, leads us smoothly on to the next of our conclusions, the fourth conclusion, which is about the need for collaboration. That as you said, Avedis, this is not something that a single organization can do on its own. There's a need for much better collaboration. There's lots of talk about it, but the reality there is much less of it. And what we found from the research is that there's the need for collaboration in sort of two vectors. The first is better collaboration between the corporate sector and government, because in many cases, the issues that are faced by the apparel sector are not specifically industry issues, they're societal issues. Look at the challenge, for example, of the ready-made garments industry in Bangladesh. The power of that sector within the Bangladeshi parliament means that getting change to happen is quite difficult. So there's a need to work more closely between industry and government. But there's also a need for much better vertical integration between different players in the industry. And as we show in the report, the data shows pretty clearly that despite lots of claims to the contrary, actually most brands and retailers will not invest in their suppliers. And until that changes, it's going to be difficult to make collaboration, to make sustainability sustainable. To come back to you, Craig, you were beginning to talk earlier about the need for collaboration, particularly on the ground. So perhaps you'd like to pick up on that point in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Peter. And I think it's been really well covered by some of the panelists already, but the simple reality is that nobody has all the answers. And in fact, recognising the context, expectations and interests of your stakeholders and rights holders, and then directly involving them is key to ensuring that both nature and society can mutually benefit from any of these sort of sustainability projects we're talking about. So this includes, I think, developing relationships along supply chains, but for us here on the ground, one of our key partners, for example, are local communities who actually live in and around our plantation and conservation areas. And the key interests of these community partners are actually quite practical, tangible, and pragmatic. And so, we need to come up with solutions that address their immediate concerns. They don't care about SDGs or global commitments or certification. They care about the things that directly impact their ability to put food on the table and provide certainty for their families, security for their families. And so in saying that, I think collaborations also need to recognise the need for technical partners, reputable and experienced actors. For us in the environment side, it's people like Flora and Fauna International, Wildlife Conservation Society, Earthworm Trust, those sort of technical people who can bring and help you structure and deliver on your commitments. As well, I should say it's critical to engage with your critics. And it's not always easy. And in some cases, it's not always possible to achieve agreement with all those involved in collaborations, but it is critical that perspectives are acknowledged. And I think that's why it's important for all parties to accept a science-based approach in working together, because science provides a common ground for, and I'm not just because I'm a scientist, by the way, although I am biased, science provides a common ground, a common language, and also a common way to report, monitor and verify claims. And large-scale sustainability projects like the ones we're working on here in Rio can only benefit from taking a science-based approach and leveraging off that for collaborations with local communities, governments, technical experts, universities, research organisations, and other networks to inform our strategy and guide outcomes. These collaborations, from our perspective, are absolutely critical to the success. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Craig. Much appreciated. Okay, so we've gone through four of our conclusions, and the last is perhaps the most significant, which is that sustainability is only really going to work in a context of addressing wider business models. And there is probably a need for a fairly fundamental shift in how the sector operates. And perhaps the COVID crisis has shown that in rather stark contrast, stark relief. As at July this year, 21 brands still had not paid for goods that have been ordered and delivered during the COVID outbreak. And that's $16 billion of revenues, which are not there to improve workers' pay, to ensure that factories can invest in health and safety, and to ensure that environmental degradation doesn't take place in the way in which textile crops are manufactured. Fast fashion. We many of us like the idea of being able to, buy just the latest look, in the high street days after it's been on the catwalk. But that can lead both in factories to excessive overtime on the part of workers, and obviously huge amounts of clothes that gets discarded, almost never worn. So until those practices, those fundamental business models that companies employ are questioned and addressed, it's very difficult to see how sustainability in the sector can be sustainable. Or at least, at the very least, claims around sustainability need to be taken with a sort of pinch of salt. So really what needs to happen is that sustainability needs to become central to business decision making within organizations. Obviously, we're beginning to see some shifts that might help that happen. We're seeing beginning the introduction of due diligence supply chain regulation in Germany and and Europe, and even I think in the US they're beginning to look at it as well, and the UK. So that may well shift things. And I think Tara, you wanted to pick up on that point.
Yeah, I do think it's a really interesting time. I mean, quite a large portion of the sector has been inviting regulation for some time, actually, and not shying away from that, because they're looking for a level playing field and fairness in trading sustainably and making the investment, so that the investment, and the work to deliver a more sustainable fashion economy is a shared burden and not only picked up by the leaders in the sector. So I think, implements like the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Textiles Roadmap in the EU will bring a lot more focus and help businesses in a supported way, actually, to transition to a more sustainable future, because it does need to be regulated. It needs to be fair. And actually engaging in that policy conversation right now is important, because regulators, typically are not experts in the complexities of our sector and the depth that we've been talking today. So you need to join that conversation and comment on those policy measures through forums like the Textile Exchange and the discussions we're having today, to really make sure that the policy that comes fits.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's very good advice. Notwithstanding that politicians always want to pretend that they're experts on whatever the topic is at the moment, but I think that they're we know that not always to be the case. I think also, to pick up on that point, I think it's important to make sure that well-intentioned regulation doesn't lead to adverse consequences. That if you have because there is a risk that it just leads companies to go towards larger, perhaps Western suppliers, where things are simpler to manage than perhaps elsewhere in the world, which again maybe comes to the importance of what Avedis and his organization does. But yes, I think that will be an interesting time to actually see how that does shift the industry. Okay, right. Well, that sort of wraps up the structured part of the session. We've gone through the 5 conclusions from the report. So we're now getting some quite interesting questions from the audience. So I'm going to read them out. Jeff Strawn asked Tara and Lorraine to talk about the Danish EPA has painted a rather bad picture of organic cotton, and certainly some of the early research I did gave a slightly more nuanced view of organic cotton. So perhaps Lorraine and Tara, you could make a few comments on that.
Sure. I think it's interesting, that overall the direction of travel for organic is about, the elimination of synthetic fertilizers, the elimination of toxic and persistent chemicals. And it truly is a destination and a journey as well. So I know there's several different studies that have gone out, but we have a lot of evidence through Rodale Institute and some other university-based research that organic and the Organic Center, there's a lot of positive benefits when it comes to building soils. We even see it in the work that U.S. Trust Protocol is doing on Soil Health Institute, of the importance of building soils and moving away from synthetic fertilizers. And so it's like when you take an LCAs are very interesting. They're a snapshot in a particular time, and they don't always they don't have a full picture of everything that's going on. It doesn't talk about the biodiversity. It doesn't talk about, the health of the community with the clean water, because it doesn't have the pesticides, chemicals in it. So I think, any type of research you have to look has to be balanced in the broader context of what's happening.
Okay.
I think that's right. And I think there's immense value in progressing sustainability, both for organic and for conventionally grown cotton across the piece. Really, you've acknowledged in the report the scaling challenge around organic at the moment, but of course it's contributing enormous learning to the sector, and we have to keep cross-populating the learning on sustainable inputs at farm level, techniques that farmers can adopt, or practices. So in the trust protocol, it's agnostic actually. So all types of cotton farmers in the US will be able to measure their farm data, and we'll be able to learn from all of those different types of practices in quite a balanced and comparable way.
Okay, thanks, Tara. Andrea Canzano has come up with an interesting point. Can you really change production models without changing the consumer model on apparel? Obviously, the $1 million question is, or actually the $1 billion question is, do consumers really care? I mean, certainly with the smallholder report that we did last year, there was quite a notable gap between what consumers say they believe on sustainability versus what they actually do when they're choosing which product to buy. Avedis, I mean, I know you're not specifically a consumer-facing certification, but I'd be very interested in your views about how the brand and retail companies need to think about their relationship with consumers.
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter, and does speak to that last conclusion as well about addressing not just business models across the spectrum, which is critical, right? I mean, you heard from Rhea and Tara a specific example, but just broadly speaking, everything we do in society from sort of a business point of view is about trade-offs. And you have to understand that you need to take into account, somebody can come up and say organic is what you want to do, but that involves certain costs. And I don't just mean in the economic sense. I mean, certain benefits to the environment are outweighed perhaps by greater water use and other potential harm in other areas. So understanding where that sweet spot is going to be how you move forward, incorporating that business model. Similarly, you have to understand the larger consumption model, which is the specific question you were asking about. And the challenge with consumers, as you've noted, is, well, first of all, they're not monolithic, right? There's this sense that there is this body of consumers and you just have to sort of talk to them all in a collective. And that's obviously not the case. You've got various generational differences. You've got obviously various income differences, all of which factor in. It's one thing for, a college student who's living still off of mom and dad's bank account to make decisions at their college store versus somebody that's trying to take care of a single mom or a single dad taking care of 4 kids. The challenge with consumers beyond that, to me, is that they tend to be very good at expressing outrage for punishing bad behavior, and that's a good thing, right? You hear about all the boycotts and the sit-ins or the die-ins on High Street, but they're not as good at consistently rewarding good behavior, right? So that's always been the challenge, and bad behavior should be punished, absolutely. Those campaigns have value, but they tend to be short-lived and they tend to be singular in their focus. We'd like to see where consumers are able to reward good behavior consistently, so you have not just an incentive for business to not behave badly, but actually a positive incentive for business to behave well. And we're getting there, I think, along the lines of some of the stuff Tara brought about, just in terms of being able to share information with consumers in ways that is easily accessible to them and easily verifiable, validatable, whether it's blockchain or whether it's through a certification program, so that consumers know that what they're getting is an independently valid reflection of the practice of the brand or retailer in question, and they can then make a decision according to that. So I do see in the future the ability to better communicate your sustainability practices to the consumer in a way that they can then make purchasing decisions based off of. But it's going to be a tough road because financial concerns will remain top of mind. And that, again, circles back to the point you made, right? The 5th point. You have to have sustainable business models. It's just not going to be possible for you on the manufacturing side even to tell a factory, I demand you treat your workers well. There was a question about wage levels. You can only push so far before it becomes impossible for that factory to stay in business. To be sustainable, to have that advanced improvement in lifestyles and responsibility, you first need to have a going concern. Otherwise, everything else becomes moot. So those business models, those consumption models, they all play into it. And understanding that bigger picture is increasingly more critical and where the challenge lies. And it ends up being about those trade-offs and finding that sweet spot, because there is not going to be, as we've already said, a single simple answer.
Lorraine, you had your hand up.
Yes, absolutely. We've been having a lot of conversations over the past year and a half with our members, and we're at 640 plus, about the dynamics of where do we get to that ROI squared, because truly the number one reason our brands and retailers don't buy more sustainable, responsible, organic fibers in general is because it costs more. There's a higher cost associated with that. So it really is about the paradigm shift from a price, the best price possible, and the drive down to, the challenges with a living wage and the challenges with fair prices to farmers. And so that really changes the dynamic. So the exciting news is that we do have a number of brands that are really leading the conversation and leading by example on really putting not only an EP&L, which is environmental profit and loss, but adding the social component as well. How do we come in here and really fairly measure the value of this product? We have more brands that are talking to their consumers with their products. There's a stronger awakening and more consumers who care about where their products come from. Is it paid a living wage? I care about, the components of this fiber. Someone's life is behind this fiber and this blouse I'm wearing. And was it made responsibly? Was it, so there is a dynamic changing, and we do have several brands that are really leading on the deal of what does a responsible business model look like. We've got several research and briefing documents that are underway of like, what is best practices? As a farmer, you asked me to have best practices. Why can't I come to you as a brand and say, I'm asking you to have best practices around your business model? And here's what that looks like. So it is a conversation that's front and center. It's a conversation that we're having in a number of different ways. We're talking about ways to, cut the paradigm of like preferential tariffs for responsible fibers and organic fibers. So we're going to have to find it. This is the complex problems require multiple interventions. And so, Peter, to your first point, it is not simple. The dynamic of creating the best business model to really adopt and enforce and support living wages and fair prices to farmers for the fibers and restorative and regenerative agriculture is like the next big, huge thing. And this is where we're going to have bold and courageous action, one step at a time. But the business model piece, it's not going to happen unless we address this, quite frankly.
Thanks. Coming to another question from Justin Guest, which comes to the C word, circularity. Sustainability is not just about production, it's about the end of life. What should the sector be doing about end-of-life materials, recover, design for recycling? Who wants to come in and comment on that really rather large agenda? Craig, you've not said anything for a while, so I'll come to you first, because I don't know who grins loudest to the question. So over to you.
Thanks. As I said before, April is the forest grower and not the manufacturer. We feed our sister companies, APR and Sattery. But in fact, April has made some quite ambitious commitments, and Rhea's leading was perfect because we've made some really ambitious commitments, which we've called our April 2030 commitments, and they include increased material efficiency and circularity, and that's about chemical recovery, which I know we've touched on earlier, and is a very sensitive issue for viscose production. We've touched on water, and we've made a commitment to a 25% less processed water use per product ton. And we've also made a very strong commitment to 20% recycled textile used, that's pre and post consumer recycled textiles used in viscose fiber. And in fact, our sister company, Sattery, is already made significant investments with a range of partners in developing innovative next generation cellulosic fibers with products like Phoenix. And clearly one of the challenges is exactly what has already been raised. They're more expensive to produce, and there is currently no market premium existing for those products. And so I don't know if it's about educating customers and brands as much as it is about explaining the processes. And of course, as they come to scale, you'll hope that the price goes down. But to get to scale, you need to ensure that you have access to a market. And so there's a bit of a chicken and egg challenge there, of course, for companies to go into the investments related to recycled and recycled fashion. Thanks, Peter.
Who else wants to come in on this one? It's obviously a rather challenging area.
I'll be happy to pitch in, because there's probably, I don't know, I think we were just telling it this morning, over 20 different amazing initiatives, mainly regionally focused, that are really working on circularity as far as the recyclability piece, and cities that are voting in laws for collection pieces. There's a number of companies that are really telling some great stories. There's a company in Milan that's been started in the 20s with recycling wool, army blankets into fibers and materials. So it's amazing recycling and circular systems and solutions. There's also a lot of happening on the business model side of what does it look like to go into, retake and resale and redo. So there's some great innovations happening. So the challenge, I think, for circularity right now is that we have, because it has to be regionally based, that it's not something that just can scale. It has to be something that's replicated region by region. And so I'm very hopeful that I think that's one of the things that can be ramped up rather quickly across these regions. It's going to require some investments, but there's business model reasons to do that. So there's some great things happening out there. We just need to be willing to replicate them, make the investment to spread those in various regions.
Peter, I think we've lost you.
Sorry. There's a need to sort of balance two things, that on the one hand, a sort of global norm, for want of a better way of putting it, but at the same time, that's still being appropriate for local situations. But also, which is what I hope we're trying to do with the Apparel Barometer, it's being able to share those good experiences. There's that sort of collaboration perhaps needs to happen more. Specific question to you, Tara, from Paula Rogers. Does the US Trust Protocol labeling only apply to 100% cotton, or a mix of US and other cotton sources or fibers? I think there's sort of a couple of questions in there. Is it just cotton, or is it other fibers, and is it just US or others as well? So Tara, over to you.
Okay, well, important to clarify at this stage, unless it's a new program as well, that the focus is really on engagement at the farm level and tracking of that data up through the supply chain. So it's a business to business focused initiative in this instance, but it is powering the data that brands will use to communicate to their consumers about the impacts of their products. So that's going to be through aspects like product labeling or corporate reporting on their impacts of their products and how they're tracking their reductions. It's not intended from the first instance to give a consumer hang tag, for example, but we will be working with brands to work out how they want to communicate that best as part of their overall approach to sustainable raw materials and the commitments they've made. But certainly in terms of the operational aspect of the Trust Protocol, you are not required to use only US Cotton Trust Protocol fibre. It's about tracking US cotton through your supply chain, and that can be alongside other fibres. But it's the US cotton portion of your product that we would be tracking in the value chain and providing the transparency for.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Question from Eric Ho, saying that in some industries, groups of consumers have been brought together to demonstrate that they are prepared to pay more, for example, for organic products. What does the panel think about whether the textile industry can have a united effort to influence end consumers? We're back on the sort of consumer issue here. What thoughts might people have?
We actually did a little bit of research and went to some organic food programs. And it was like, it's more than food, it's fiber too. And we actually did some surveys and things like that. And it's amazing, people that are committed and would only buy organic milk had no idea that you could buy organic sheets or socks or anything. So it's interesting that, while they're dedicated and they all bought into the organic production systems and what it does for soil, blah, 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 all the stuff. It's like, they don't even have fiber and materials on their radar screen. So it shows that even educated consumers don't really know where their products come from. They think milk comes from a grocery store, or something. So I think that there's a significant amount of education that we could do through, the organic food conduits and that organic food customer. So yeah, there's a lot of, where do you start with consumer education? And it is a challenge, even with what I perceived as an educated consumer. So it is about buying habits. It's about educating and engaging consumers. That's going to be a big obstacle, and that's why we want to empower brands and have them, talk to their consumers more effectively and engage them. They already have that conduit. So what do we do to help them convey the value of more sustainable and responsible and organic products?
Okay, thank you, Avedis. And then I'll come to Craig because you're nodding vociferously on this one as well. So
I think Rhea made the key point there, which is this is an exercise in consumer education, and it will take time, and it will in part be aided by the point I was making earlier in terms of being able to have verifiable, solid information that can be shared with consumers. One of the reasons why the food piece of it did take off is because a lot of that is properly labeled and credibly validated, whether by regulators or other programs that consumers have gotten to trust. We don't yet have equivalence in the textile space, whether it is for material or whether it is for social compliance. But with more recognition and more verifiable information transmission to consumers, that might change. But I also do want to make the point, and again, I think Lorraine sort of hinted at this, and go back to the observation, both first and fifth of the barometer. We shouldn't be looking at consumers as the solution, right? Just get them to change and everything else will follow. There is a holistic sort of entanglement of issues here that need to be kept in mind. And so I would suggest that continuing to work at that confluence of consumer, industry, government, standards is where you need to focus your energies, and not simply say, well, here's my path and this is where I'm going to concentrate. I wouldn't be betting all my money on that one approach as an answer. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. Craig, do you want to add something to that?
And that's exactly what I was going to say. We've already said earlier, there's no one single solution, there's no magic bullet, and trying to shift this discussion purely to consumers is not going to solve the problem. There still needs to be action all the way through the supply chain back to growers, in fact, if we're going to work on this problem together. And it's complicated, it's difficult, but simply shifting the focus to the consumer is not going to ultimately achieve the answer that we're all looking for here. But thanks very much.
Okay, cool. Right, we've got time for me to give you one last question before we end, which actually follows on quite nicely from what Craig's just been saying, that if we can't just rely on the consumer, what other points of pressure might there be? And Leslie Schell's asked about ESG investors. Sky News has been having a big thing on ESG this past week. To what extent do any of you believe that is, really shifting the dial? Tara, perhaps come to you.
I think I'm going to call that a sort of medium-term impact on the way that the industry responds. I think it probably is affecting some areas more imminently than others. So I have seen activity in the responsible investor sector really looking for investment. So it's a good time if you're an innovator in sustainable textiles, if you're generating new fibers, if you're providing solutions, it's a great time to be on the radar of investors. There is money. But in terms of the flip side of that, and are investors really driving the activity for business? I think there's probably still a gap there, and that gap comes from understanding and their ability to really measure and trust the data that's available, and there isn't a lot of data available. We've talked about that already, how complex it is, how we can't compare apples with oranges. So if you're not even in the sector and you're sitting outside of that as an investor or finance organization, how do you really get a grip on which companies are doing the right thing and therefore are more investable? But for sure, the BlackRock, etc., it's maturing. So I think that's going to keep gathering momentum. I certainly hope it does.
So again, the need for information and insight and communication. Anyone else have any last comments to make on that point? Okay, right. We are now very much at 2 o'clock. Well, 2 o'clock here, o'clock, whatever time, wherever you are, is. So I'm going to call the discussion to close. Quickly, just to say where we see the process going next, the barometer is with the printers at the moment, or not the printers, the designers at the moment. So it should be available in the next day or two. So I hope you'll all enjoy reading that. Where do we go next? We would like to see this process being an annual ongoing cycle to try and revisit the issues that came out of this this year's barometer, and to see how things evolve over time, and hopefully to become another resource along with the other excellent resources that are out there for insight, knowledge in this sector, and to support companies in approaching the challenges they face, and very much be practical. It's not about talking, as Avedis said earlier on, it's not about sort of high level strategic. It's okay, so on a Monday morning, what do you need to do differently? What difference in behaviors do you need to be exhibiting? But for the time being, I'd like to thank very, very much our panelists, Avedis Seferian from RAP, Tara Luckman from U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, Larry Pepper from Textile Exchange, and Craig Tribolet from April. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks very much for your comments. It's been really good fun as well, apart from anything else. So thanks very much. And to the audience, thank you for attending.